Well, it's 4 o'clock Eastern Time, and that means it's time for our next Edchat Interactive. Today we'll be talking about grading, uh, or as some of us call it, degrading. And our leader is going to be Dave Nagel. So I'd like to start off a little bit. First, for those of you who are not familiar with Shindig, I'll do a brief overview of the Shindig platform, which is what we're using. And let me just quickly go back to my first slide. So hopefully go back to my first slide. Okay. And first, a little bit about Edchat Interactive. Edchat Interactive was started by myself, Steve Anderson, and Tom Whitby. And it was started because we noticed that there's a lot of really great things going on in education and not a lot of great ways to share them. And we thought that by providing a forum for education leaders to online get before an audience and participate with them and talk with them, that would be a much better way of sharing the information rather than webinars. And so we created Edchat Interactive as a way for people to share information, not just broadcast it. Now, we're using the Shindig platform, and there's a few things that you should know about Shindig. First of all, if you look at your icon, you'll see that there are two buttons under the icon. One is raise your hand, and the second is ask question. If you ask a question as the moderator, I'll see the question. If it's a technical question, we can handle it, or I can pass it on to somebody from Shindig. And if it's a question regarding grading or regarding school, I can pass it on to Dave, and he can either answer it right there. He'll even call you up to the stage to answer engage in a dialogue with you to answer the question. Then the other icon underneath your avatar is something called raise hand. And here's your chance to get me to more quickly move into the presentation, because I want to see how many people have been on Shindig before. So if you've been on Shindig before, I'd like you to click the raise hand icon. And I see one. If I could get most of you raising your hands, then I'll quickly wide and a little bit more about Shindig. Okay, let me explain a little bit more about Shindig then, just to make sure that everybody knows what they're doing. If you move your cursor over your icon, you'll see that there's 5 different choices. I am allows you to send text messages to any person or to every person here. It's kind of like a back channel if you want to. And then there's an icon marked privacy or a lock. If you click on that, then nobody will be able to talk with you. If you click it again, then you're opening up the lock and people can't talk to you. There's a way to mute yourself or unmute yourself. And there's a picture of a camcorder which allows you to work on or adjust your camcorder settings. One thing is, you notice very often, these stages are a little bit small. If you want to increase the size of a stage, you notice in the bottom right-hand corner of the stage is an icon that allows you to expand it so you can read the text a little bit better. And then once it's expanded, there's another icon in the top right-hand corner which allows you to contract it back again. Why we've chosen Shindig is the ability for you all to interact with each other and share what you're doing. That's what I'd like you all to do now. If you click on somebody's avatar, you'll be able to have a private video chat with that person, or up to 3 or 4 or even 5 people in a chat room. So what I'd like you to do for the next couple minutes is click on another person's icon and get into a discussion and talk to them about what your grading practices are or their grading practices are and what you'd like to get out of the session. And I have it as 4:04 minutes. I'll come back on stage and I'll introduce Dave. So I'm coming down now and talk to each other. Well, so a lot of interesting combinations of people having conversations one-on-one, one-on-two, and I think you've seen the power of Shindig, and that's why we've chosen the Shindig platform. Uh, Before I introduce Dave, I just want one more slide, and that is to let you know that next week we have another really good week. We've got on Tuesday we Tom Murray and Jeff Soule talking about how to create engaging professional learning. And on June 4th, we have Ryan Schaff talking about games in education, which is really, games have become incredibly hot because a lot of people have discovered that games not only engage the kids and teach the kids, but they also assess the kids as they're learning without need for uh, having to have formal tests. So be sure to go on to Edchat Interactive and take a look at those two at those two sessions. And now I'd like to stop presentation and bring up Dave. Hey, you're on.
Excellent. So how are you?
So, oh, good. Welcome to Shindig. Welcome to Edchat Interactive. So, I just realized I didn't give you that much of an introduction. Maybe you could just describe your experience, a little bit about your experience in education to people.
Sure. And I just want to, I just as your question, Mitch, most of the folks I connected with was fine. There was a few that there was a delay. So if you have a delay with the sound, please let Mitch know. But I'm really excited to be here. I mean, honored and humbled. My background has pretty much been in secondary, and obviously the title of the book and really the focus of our conversation today will be on a topic that I think we all acknowledge is a tough one in our profession to really target and try to get right, try to have it have the impact on learning that we're kind of monitor with assessment or instruction or positive behavior intervention. Grading's been that one that's been a little bit different. But my background was as a middle and high school teacher and administrator. I worked my entire career either in a 7, 8, 9 situation or a 10, 11, 12 situation, both as a teacher and then as a high school administrator in the largest high school in Indiana. And through some of the practices that I'm going to share specifically today, certainly they weren't the only factor, but we really transformed a district that had a lot of pride in its athletics and band and everything else, but finally realized our graduation rate was really starting to struggle, and we increased about in 4 years. And certainly it wasn't just some of the practices related to grading and feedback, but I would tell you they had a big impact. And so from then, I really just have dove into that topic through all my work in the field, whether it's assessment or PLCs or leadership. Grading's kind of been there. So to get a book published with Corwin and have a chance to share some of these ideas and hopefully have them be adapted. And I'm going to kind of stress that word today. By other school leaders and teachers that are on the Edchat and those that hear about it. It's pretty exciting.
So I'm going to bring it down in a second. I just have one more question for you, and that is, I know, 20 years ago, there was, grades were just part of the atmosphere. Nobody cared that. I mean, the kids cared and their parents cared, but a grade was just a grade. What's changed?
Well, I'm not quite sure if your statement is completely accurate. I think a lot of it depends on the school, the culture that you're in. Um, the idea that kids care about their grades is a little bit of a misnomer because I think it's our definition of caring. Um, and even still today, realistically, what we want to focus on, I'm going to bring in some of the key points from John Hattie's work and being a visible learning consultant, very fortunate to do that. You really look at learning and impact much more than the actions that you're putting in place. So if students are trying to quote unquote get a letter on their report that doesn't have any meaning and doesn't equate to true learning, the question is why are we even doing it? And is it at times been maybe the dirty little secret in our profession that nobody has wanted to acknowledge that for literally a century? Look at Starch and Elliott's research. We've had battles around what grades should include and what they shouldn't. And I think we owe our profession too much to not have a deeper conversation.
Okay, and with that, I'm going to bring myself down. I'll bring your presentation up, and we can start the deeper conversation.
Excellent. Well, again, I appreciate everybody's time and coming on this today. In our profession, it's somewhat trite. We always talk about how busy we are. I don't think other than maybe July 3rd, 4th, and 5th, or maybe December 24th through January 2nd, are we not truly busy? But May is certainly a time I think that's busier than others. So I'm really going to try very hard and seeking your feedback to make today's session practical. And I do want to just kind of do a little bit of a preview. When Mitch and I did a practice run yesterday, we really decided that we want to focus the conversation today. So while the book, and I'm going to highlight this in a minute, has several pieces, we're really going to focus today on decreasing unnecessary failure, and we're going to look at those strategies today and that aspect, and then come back again, actually lie and go a little bit deeper with standards reference grading. So I just want to be really transparent where we're headed and why. So one thing though that I want to mention before we get into the content, I was kind of studying some history recently, and I was on the History Channel, and most people don't know this, but actually Moses, he struggled. He had a bicep problem. He could only carry 2 tablets. There was actually a third tablet on Mount Sinai that had a commandment that he never brought down. Um, I'll wait for the time release joke that I'm trying to apply here. But literally, it's unfortunate, I think, in our profession that we've had this kind of be the mentality that we can have open and honest dialogue around assessment or instruction, and we've tried to create a team structure where we share ideas. But grading has been the one area that we've allowed to let it just be whatever a classroom teacher determines and decides. And so part of my passion for addressing this is I've got 3 young men living in my house that don't always behave and don't always do the things they need to do, and I want to make sure when they get to high school and they get to middle school, we don't confuse biology with behavior. And I need the kind of feedback as a parent to know when the grade isn't what it is. Do I take them to Sylvan, or do I take them? I take away their PlayStation. And so often we've convoluted grades to where they have very little meaning. Tom Gusky calls it hodgepodge because we combine everything into one. And that happens very often at the secondary level because we don't have the deep conversations with our peers about how and why we grade. So, Mitch, if you jump to the next slide, just a quick overview. And again, if you have any interest or desire to go deeper with some of the topics I'm going to address today, I've set the book up in a way that allows each section to kind of be independent. And so, certainly there's a benefit and merit to reading it cover to cover, although I wouldn't advise taking it to the beach for leisure reading. But I'm very humbled by some of the feedback I've received, and a lot of that has been from practitioners like yourself. In fact, I selected Jeff Erickson from Minnetonka High School in Minnesota to write the foreword as a very solid principal that's done a lot of great work. But each section really addresses a different aspect, whether it's having the deep conversation of why this is a tough selling point, a critical element that practice trumps policy. We can set all the policy we want, but it's the practices in the classroom, monitoring their implementation, and those core grading actions as a school that we're going to implement. Today, we'll address a little bit of Section 3 with failure prevention. And certainly, we have to then look at when learning doesn't happen in 18 weeks. What do we do differently to have credit or learning recovery? And then, as I mentioned in July, we'll come back to the standards reference grading. And then last but not least, the implementation elements, which are critical at the secondary level to have these conversations around what I would call grading givens and establishing early those parameters and areas that you're going to go deeper with. And in some districts I've worked specifically in, they've abandoned and moved away from the sort of the valedictorian race of a 1/10 of a decimal point determining a very prestigious honor, and somebody who's third or fourth and they might not give a speech probably has just as much academic ability and everything else, to more of a college-based high honors summa cum laude, magna cum laude. In some districts that's just not the culture that they can have. So have those early conversations so you don't get bogged down by things that will get in the way emotionally. So if we could jump on to the next piece, I want to walk through the first section, and we'll divide today up into two sort of 8 to 10 minute pieces by myself, and then you'll have a chance to process, come together, and learn from each other about how we adapt and apply some of these ideas, concepts, and strategies. But I want to challenge anyone in the room, but specifically if we have any high school level administrators or middle school administrators, and certainly not abandoning the elementary teachers that have joined us today, because the concepts and ideas are certainly adaptable there. But are we spending more time preventing failure or enduring it? Dr. Stephen Heck, who was my professor at Butler when I got my master's, said literally every night, amateurs react and repair, professionals prepare and prevent. So I want to talk to us today, and if we could jump to the next slide, Mitch, about the need to support students when they come to us, especially at the secondary level, and I'm going to kind of push into high school a little bit. Students that are failing, students that are struggling, rarely is that their first time. And if it is their first time, there's a really good chance even more why we need to have the conversation at the elementary and middle layer, because if they're just now having failing grades and struggling in high school, maybe there's been a sign of inflation or lack of accuracy, but they need support. And we often hear teachers, and I agree totally, that teach kids resiliency and witness. Well, we teach them that by allowing them to do the work. And very often we kind of have some ideas and where tradition trumps evidence, where we don't accept late work because we think it's going to teach students that lesson. I was presenting literally on April 15th, and it couldn't have been put on a tee for me when somebody said from the audience, they simply don't accept late work. And I said, it really stinks that the IRS does, because it would have been very nice on that day for me just to say, I'm not going to do it. Mitch, if you would go ahead and flip to the next slide. I'm just going to speak just for a moment. We're going to have a chance to process here shortly around sort of a framework that I've devised for all of the strategies that really relate to preventing, and I'm going to really stress that, unnecessary failure. That failure that can be prevented, failure that can be addressed throughout the semester, or not getting wrapped up in that 18-week element where time is the variable and learning the constant. But as I mentioned just a moment ago, the idea that we look early to support students in their learning, and kind of going around what I call the SITE model, and it's a pretty simple acronym, but first and foremost, that we intervene early. That high school teachers, with rare exception, if we start the school year, for example, my son will start school August 14th. By Labor Day, most teachers know the students that are in danger of failure. So we intervene early, and must speak to a few strategies related to that during our second segment. Maybe we invest more time creating incentives for students as opposed to trying to find the biggest consequence to punish them when they don't. And if we've ever had a student that we've given a 0 to, or we've penalized them with a penalty for late work, are we seeing them more engaged later in the semester and doing more work? So what incentives could we create for students to turn work in early and to receive more feedback, or have some layer that is encouraging the right behavior as opposed to just trying to eliminate the bad one? I mentioned the time element, and just, all joking aside, in high school, we've had this number of 18 being our magic number. In Indianapolis here, we thought that was the magic number 2. We thought 18 was the only quarterback that could ever lead our team. Unfortunately, we have lucked out since. That's another time release joke for those of you that aren't football fans. But in high school, we've had this number of 18 being the magic number when students can or should meet all the requirements in a course. It's even scary to think students could possibly meet all the requirements in a biology class in 15 weeks, but very often some are going to need more, but they often don't go from 18 to needing 36. So how can we make sure we allow enough time and even extend it if necessary? And last but not least, and Marzano has spoken about this for years, that if we think there is a potential for failure, then we want to collect more evidence to know where the student is. But the evidence has to be relevant. It has to be relevant to specific learning needs, and not, being just very honest, sometimes the busy work of the elements that are at the very surface layer and really wouldn't equate us to making an inference from what he knows. And so that evidence piece is really critical when we're talking about a vertical alignment in a high school where the chemistry teacher and biology teacher feel accountable to each other. Just like the JV football and the varsity football coach are accountable to each other, are they collecting the right kinds of evidence? So Mitch, if you would flip to our first reflection question slide. And I know we didn't hit any practices yet. I promise we will in the next segment. But just some quick reflection on the SITE model, and sort of as a guide to drive some of our grading and feedback actions that are looking at preventing students from getting off track, especially for our freshmen and sophomores, and especially for the students that are new to our school early in their careers, if there are sixth graders in middle school, as a guide to drive some grading and feedback actions. So I'm going to turn it back to Mitch and let him give the specific directions for our learning time from each other, and I will join a few groups, and then we'll come back in a few minutes to debrief.
Okay, so this is the time where everybody gets a chance to talk to each other about the first segment of that Dave has gone through. Dave talked about the support, intervention, incentive, time, and evidence model, the SITE model for intervening with students. And what we'd like you to do is to click on the icon of another person and just talk about, gee, was there time, were there times where support could have gone better in your school? And if so, how? Were there interventions that you made that were right on, or were there interventions that missed? What types of incentives are you giving? Are you emphasizing time, or are you emphasizing what students are learning, and what evidence are you collecting about students? So click on another person's icon, talk with each other. Dave is going to be floating from group to group, and then after a few minutes, after about 5 or 6 minutes, we'll pull Dave back up and we'll kind of decompress about some of the things that you've talked about, and hopefully we'll get a few of you to come back up here. So now's the time. Click on another person's icon. I'll leave the next slide up with the question. Notice that there's actually 2 rooms here, so if you wanted to talk to somebody in a different room, you could go into another room and talk to somebody in a different room. So I'm going to pull myself down. I'll move to the next slide and encourage you to talk to each other. Well, it looks like a lot of you have had a chance to click on other people and discuss with them, discuss the questions. I'm going to bring Dave up.
Hey.
So were you able to go from person to person? Did you have any good discussions?
I had good discussions. I didn't go person to person. I definitely want to apologize to Tim, and I'll reconnect with you again. We had
That's
a
okay.
delay in ours, but I did speak with Michael and Brian, who actually are at a school that I've been at before. I'd like to bring them up to bring a really key point that they talked about, something that is really needed, that we actually kind of addressed earlier, but we went fast. So
So who do you want to bring up?
they're hiding now.
Well,
Michael Smith, and he's got
Michael Smith, I have him. Okay, I'm going to stop my broadcast and I'm going to bring him back up, although I'm not sure he's at his computer right now.
We're a second ago. There we go.
We're here, Dave.
So, Michael and Brian, if you could just bring up that point when you said, these concepts and everything else, what it really depends on. I want to let you kind of speak first, and then maybe we'll address a little bit as a group to the rest of the folks on the chat.
In terms of my comments or Mike's?
Either one. The piece about the collaboration.
Well, the collaboration, it's got to be a school-wide incentive-based program for the students. I mean, it can't be individual teachers that are making. Not that we don't have the ability to make these decisions, but I think it's if you have here's the standard, here's what we have, or incentives, and stick to them. I guess that's where I'm going with it. I guess it's got to be school-wide rather than left up to individual.
Sure.
And the collaboration component is very powerful, Dave. We all agree with you. Here, Neil Hanlon's sitting here at the same table with us. And as you and I were just talking about, it's assisting our unique student population group to have that, to instill a sense of ownership for their own academic achievement, and doing that through your core grading system, focusing on reporting out on progress behaviorally and academically. But it's a process that is continually it's continually evolving here because of our students coming to us throughout the year, and it's a new cell. And some of them have not met with success within the classroom, and so immediately they'll come in and be they'll shut down. And it's our job, just as if they were an automobile over on the side of the road, to pop the hood, put out the jumper cables, and jumpstart them.
Sure. I mean, you guys mentioned several things there. I mean, I got about 4 or 5 thoughts to pyramid. We can keep this conversation going. One about the resilience, and again, the school that they're speaking of, I actually have been there several times, and they do have a culture where students are coming in and they probably more than likely have had multiple failures at different levels, not just academics. So the early ones just sometimes perpetuate and permeate that belief. And some of the fascinating studies. And sometimes when you look at a research study, and my father would say it's really a blinding flash to the obvious, but Cox's study is so powerful in that letting students not be told the truth, or it's not that we're not holding academic rigor and all those other things, but that how often failures permeate and stay with students a decade after high school and prevent them from seeking skills and things that can improve their life and jobs that are going to not only sustain them but sustain all of us, happen sometimes from exactly what you're talking about and not preventing that failure or extending the time or the support. The other quick piece though, just for the group, is we kind of really moved into a chapter 5 in the book is where I kind of talk about some of the practices in the site model, but that core grading practice of focused, intentional, structured collaboration. And in literally a dozen school districts that I've either worked in or cited their policy, their principles for grading, it's written in there. Fontana, California, it's written in their policy that weighting and what assignments are scored and how they're scored in final exams are all PLC decisions. Because what happens so often is I am going to just saying as a teacher who's working very hard, I'm going to grade the way I want in my room, and I don't expect you to worry about it because I don't worry about how you're grading in your room because that's how I do it. And we haven't, number one, had the conversation about the impact on students, but more importantly, I think we need to have the conversation how it's impacting the teachers. Because that student in my class that is not engaged, that is bored, could be because the peer that I go out on Friday nights and have beers with um, actually didn't pass him when he was more than proficient in the skill because there was something that should not have been involved in the grade. Or a child that's in my class that's sweet and kind, but is nowhere near proficient, and I'm having a hard time communicating that to his or her parents, has bumper stickers all over the minivan because the peer that I also go out and have beers with on Friday that I'm friends with, or soda, whatever we drink, but that person that I interact with has inflated their grade. And the more we can have teachers realize the connectivity for accuracy, for relevancy, for making assignments and tasks have the right amount of rigor is critical. One, to getting the conversation going, because then we get people going, all right, I'm not sure how this is going to look, but I can at least admit we need to not be independent contractors united by a common parking lot. We need to have the conversation. How we have it, allowing a lot of teacher voice and not having things done to them, certainly, but if we don't have collaboration that focuses on grading, and I just want to maybe challenge the group, and I would have to raise my hand that we did not do this to any level that we should have. How many PLC structures, how many PLC settings do we have in our schools that grading and grading practices and what we grade and the level of rigor of the assignments we use, how often does that come to the table of conversation in a PLC setting? So that's another piece that I include with some relevant examples in the book for how schools have started to have that kind of conversation. So Mitch, are we moving on to the next piece? I'd almost, I would almost like if it's okay to move on, and then we might have a little bit more time. I hear some folks saying that there's some choppiness, so I'm going to talk slower because I know I talk fast anyway. But if you're having that trouble, please let me know. Awesome. So what I'm going to do now, and again, probably about 10 minutes, but I think this will give us a little bit longer chance to have a discussion next and maybe kind of apply a couple of very specific, but I think very, very adaptable practices. One of the things I really tried to place in this, certainly, I'd like to say that I'm very fortunate that I can cite and stand on the shoulders of giants like Ken O'Connor and Tom Guskey and others that have paved the way for like myself to publish a book and cite a lot of their research and their work. Um, but is to also put as many practical, relevant examples in there that are adaptable, that allow that level of flexibility. But I always ask any group, and again, specifically, obviously middle and high school is where I've done most of my grading work. You have to weigh any of the practices I mentioned here with the benefits and the drawbacks, and each and every one has a benefit. Each and every one has some level of drawback. But if we're finding too many drawbacks for the ones I'm going to mention, I'm going to challenge folks to say, what are the current benefits and drawbacks of existing practices, like never accepting late work and not allowing students to have what I call a stipulated second chance. Life is full of multiple opportunities. Sometimes there's a stipulation. And I think we've had a misnomer that when we provide students that extra opportunity, we're not getting them ready for the real world. That literally couldn't be anywhere near the truth. I don't often tell my wife this story, but a few years ago, I got 2 speeding tickets in 67 minutes. That's not easy to do. And about 3 months later, I got a note from the BMB that said I was going to lose my license unless I paid $200 and took a 5-hour online course. So I had to do that. I had to pay a penalty. But then my driver's license doesn't tell me now that I have to pull over when it's raining. I have the same value of my license. My penalty was something different than the quality of my ability to drive. There was a stipulation that I had to pay, but certainly there was a second chance. So giving students that opportunity to make up for what they need to with maybe a penalty of time or some other inconvenience could be a different paved road than just simply pulling the opportunity from them. So if we can move on to the next slide. So I'm going to highlight in the next about 8 to 10 minutes or so, probably a little bit less now, probably about 7 or 8 minutes, 12 for the wrap up. 3 specific practices and be as concrete as I can during this time. And then within the framework of the site model and in the book, I've included 3 more, but we're not going to get to the piece on homework and those other ones. But we're going to move on to the first one. The idea that, and again, part of what I mentioned now and in the book and in the text and with audiences is these might not appear like traditional what I think of a grading practice. And when I get that, I sometimes wonder is because we're not using math, because I'm not trying to justify how the point value here would change and the average would change if we do things. That doesn't move the needle. That doesn't change learning. That doesn't change culture. So one of the things I really want schools to think about, and certainly the Better High Schools .org has a great warning system. But some schools have created their own where they monitor or they collect and analyze or they collect and monitor the number of students that are close to failing, but they don't often sometimes put the actions in place. If we're going to monitor potential failures, we have to determine the cause and find ways to adjust or resolve the issue. And so this simple example here, I adapted from my former high school. If we have students in a department and a course team that are in danger of failure in a PLC, is it because of attendance? Or is it because of low test scores? Is it because of missing assignments? Is it because they're not working? And if that's the case, is it engagement or boredom? And certainly, I know we'd have students that we could check off for each category. But that last one, and especially early in the year, how intentional can we be to find out this is a foundational skill that they just simply don't have? And this is the piece where I think the professional development around this topic is so critical that we're not abandoning quality assessment and making inferences from student work before we just jump to the grading piece. They technically have an F because that's what my computer system is telling me because they haven't scored well on this assessment or this test. But I haven't looked to see if that test should have been lined up at the start of the year with where they were at the previous year's curriculum, or did I really use it to determine my next actions, or was it just what I possibly used before? So there's an intentionality early on. If we're going to have a monitoring system for potential failures, we have a system in place that allows teachers to make the right adjustments for why the failure is happening. We could jump to the next one. So this next strategy comes again originated the term from my former high school. Mitch, if we could jump that next slide. Mitch, you there? There we go. So we're monitoring our failure prevention, and one of my former colleagues, Larry Hurt, passed away a few years ago. Phenomenal man, amazing teacher, National Teacher of the Year runner-up. And Larry would come to our meetings, and his catchphrase was, "I have an idea, folks." And whenever you heard that, you held on tight because Larry, he was brilliant, and his mind went in a lot of directions. He said, "Let's have an amnesty day." And basically, he went into the vernacular, the root of the word amnesty, which comes from amnesia, which really means we forget. We forget the penalty, we forget the act. We just designed an instructional day that was devoted to, in all honesty, makeup work and getting caught up and letting them say there's no penalty for it, but we want to give you that chance. We could skip to the next slide. And so we just simply structured that day that way. Now, it was extremely successful. I got to tell you, my former high school was about 3,100 students, over 3,000 students, averaging about 93.5 attendance. On that day, we had over 98. So they all showed up and they all behaved and they all did their work, which wasn't a bad problem. But there was some fear, some worry that students would wait for the next amnesty day and not do their work. And while that never happened, we certainly believed it was necessary to schedule them around the teachers' needs. So they were announced. We didn't want to shoehorn English with biology, or we didn't want to shoehorn the art department with another group, because if they're working on a project, but it was part of our grading policy, our expectations that each course team or department would have two a semester. One before Halloween and one with at least 2 weeks before the final. But what evolved and what I've implemented and work with schools now is it's not just a day to make up work. It's a structured, scheduled day in the curriculum for breathing room for the teachers as much as the students. And it's also an opportunity for reteaching, not just to provide students time to do an assignment. And I have yet to hear any school that has tried and or implemented some amnesty that doesn't go, that's exactly what we should have been doing. And it aligns even with other aspects, such as Larry Ainsworth's rigorous curriculum design, where he talks about the buffer, or in his new work, Common Formative Assessments 2.0, when he talks about the bridge. It's as much for that piece as it is for students making up work. If we could go to the next slide, what takes amnesty and really gives it life is what I call a make it happen. That stands for Missing Essential Assignments Extended Chance. And again, that's that extension, it's chance. The key is on the missing. The key is on the essential. So one more time, Mitch, we can jump next slide. Now, the penalty for doing the work has always been doing the work, but it's doing the right work. And I've seen many schools that implement a ZAP program. Zeros aren't permitted, and certainly they have tremendous merit. But far too often, I've seen schools that is in place where students come to the library, they come to the cafeteria, and unfortunately, it's to make up work, mostly so I can take their assignment, put the points in my grade book. So now when I press equals, I'm getting a different number. And if that's the only reason why we're doing it, there's no reason to even do that. Because I could have done that myself by just adding the points in. And if we're not going to grade and score and provide feedback for the student's learning, it shouldn't be for that. And when that happens, we often perpetuate some of the bad behaviors in students we don't want, which is them frivolously going through work and not having it have any meaning. So the work is essential, and teachers collaborate around what are those elements within our curriculum that students should be working on. So if I miss an assignment in February and we're doing a make it happen amnesty day today, I probably shouldn't do that assignment. I should probably do maybe something extra for what we're working on now. It holds the same accountability, but might have the student more caught up for our current learning and not take him or her off track. And it might benefit me even more for people that they need to tie in now, not some assignment or some task that is not as relevant as it could be. Real quick, I just wanted to show one very authentic example. The charter school for applied technologies in Buffalo, New York, who I was working with in the early part of this decade, pulling students from Buffalo, New York, which has a high degree of struggles, like a lot of inner cities do, in their graduation rate in that part of the state is not very high. And we're pulling students, they are from that same population. They implemented something similar to this. They called it flex time. Basically, what they did is they structured the day where at 3 o'clock, everybody went home unless you were behind, or if you missed something really on my recent assessment, I could keep Mitch after school for the next Tuesday and Thursday. Well, what happened was they had a little bit of a pushback with it. And so in year 2, in 2008, I didn't include all their data here, they didn't say you get to leave at 3 unless you're behind. They said everybody stays till 4 unless you're proficient, and then you get to go home early. So they simply just flipped the script. You can see what happened with their Regents exam, and if we flip to the next slide, we can see what it did to their graduation rate. But that flex time when they were pulling students, and this did happen during the day sometimes, but it also happened during that after school time, so not every school can set it up that way. It wasn't making up work, it was making up learning and making sure reteaching or relevant evidence was collected. And so as we think about any of the pieces that we put in place with our failure prevention strategies, it's got to be about that learning piece. And again, these are simple strategies that can be adapted across the board. If we could jump to the last slide just to recap them. The idea one is we're going to have some type of early failure detection system. It involves specificity about determining why the students are not proficient and getting behind, and then a plan for a PLC collaborative team to make some decisions and put in some actions that are monitored. And really those next two, and again, I kind of added the idea that an amnesty day, it could be an amnesty period. It doesn't always have to be an entire day, where we're providing that buffer to allow students to make up work and learning and allow teachers the opportunity to do the reteaching they need to be able to do. Um, and if the assignments are relevant, rigorous, and aligned to their current learning, we have a better chance to have students catch up in their overall academics and their grade than possibly work that's not as relevant and is not targeted to what they're doing right now. So I'm going to turn it back to Mitch, and I think we'll have about 5 or 6 minutes to get in different groups and then come back together for a final debrief. Sure. Yeah. We did, as I mentioned before, my career started off in the middle school, and one of the things and I definitely kept middle school as a part of this. And again, I probably mentioned more high school examples here. There are a few states where Nevada's one where you have to earn a certain amount of credits, especially in the core areas, to go on to the high school. And I do address the value and merit and actually what the evidence says about any type of retention laws. But if we're not dealing with something like that, where the credit doesn't really change the next year, we certainly have a different approach. But what's critical is that we are getting students to develop that piece of resilience. So as I mentioned in my former middle school and several that I've cited in the book, one I'm working with now, EA Hall Middle School in Pajaro Valley, Unified out in California. Some of the same ideas and same strategies I'm talking about being adapted that are focusing, for example, with amnesty days, focusing on the time, but they don't really have a lot of benefit unless we are making sure the assignments are relevant. They're rigorously aligned vertically within our middle school, and we're having at least some degree of conversations with our high school. But the idea that we're going to put together strategies and actions after we've determined what our essential learning targets are, what students would need to do to meet those, and that providing time, structure, and quality teaching, that is everything that we're talking about here with grading. And it's also communicating clearly with our parents and our students and our other staff. And one of the questions I will challenge folks with sometimes is, if you're walking out of the grocery store, and so taking this example literally last week with a middle school teacher, with 2 bags of groceries and it's raining and I walk into you and I'm that parent that, if you give me the right answer, I'm going to leave you alone. If not, I keep you out here in the rain, or worse, I'm going to ask to see you next week on your prep period and talk about this. And I say, you're starting a unit on fill in the blank, World War II, chemistry, genetics. What does my son need to do to get an A or a B plus? I'm not going to accept he needs to complete his homework, do his tasks. I'm going to want something concrete. He's going to have to analyze the cause of the war, write an argumentative essay, and use the vocabulary properly. If we get that conversation going in our middle schools and our high schools, then our grades have to revolve around when they can do that and how close or far away are they to that, because they didn't say he has to do it with a friendly disposition with all of his work handed in on time. That came later. So yeah, great question. I think the only thing that is different is one, most elementary schools, and certainly I hope they're at least going to this level, moving away from the idea that I'm going to tell a parent of a child at the primary level that everything about their math, English, science, or social studies should be rolled up into one grade. Now, that isn't relevant at any level in terms of being effective, but it's even less at the elementary school. So if we take not failure prevention, but if we have learning targets for our students to be at a certain place by first 6 weeks, second 6 weeks in that matter, and they're not there, it's not failure prevention as it is making sure we're having the right gains in learning. So why are they behind? Is it an academic skill? Is it a foundational skill? It's often rarely the late work turned in. The whole idea of an amnesty day that we're providing a buffer within an elementary school's first 5 weeks of the school year to provide additional time for reteaching of foundational skills that our kids need at any grade level. But let's just take 4th grade, that they have to have some level of math facts, some level of reading comprehension for text analysis. And so we're just providing a buffer day and making sure that the work and evidence we collect from them in a quote unquote make it happen. It's not to make up the work to put in the grade book because there's a grade coming out and you need to be academically eligible to play sports. It's to make sure that myself and my peers, when I move you on to 5th grade, I'm giving an accurate, honest report of what your next learning needs are. So these strategies are just as relevant at the elementary level. Their reason for implementation